Welcome back, students. Last video for this week, we're going to talk about the structures of settlement that the Spanish use in the New World. And the first system that they adopt is called the encomienda system. The encomienda system was a system under which the Spanish government would grant charter to an area of land to someone who is then known as the encomendero. The encomendero would receive the rights to this land and authority over the Native Americans and other Spaniards who lived in the land. They were expected to maintain order in the region and to tax the inhabitants. They were expected to provide military service to the Spanish crown and Spanish rulers, and they were expected to provide evangelization. They were supposed to teach Christianity to Native Americans and to support missionaries in the region. Native Americans who lived under this system were technically free. They had weekends where they were free from work. Their families had to be kept together, and they were expected to receive, under law, they were supposed to receive payment for the work they did. However, the payment they received was low enough that relatively few of them became independent or became fully free. And we can get a better sense of this when we look at the taxation system that's established by the French government. By the Spanish government. So the Spanish government issues laws for the first time in 1542 that are laws for the New World and for their colonies in the Americas. And these laws establish that a third of what's produced by the encomenderos will be taxed to the church. Another third will be taxed to the government, to the Spanish crown. And so you're looking at a tax rate of over 60%, and yet these encomenderos are still becoming fantastically wealthy. And so this is a sign that they're paying the Native Americans who are working on the encomiendas very little. Now, the Spanish rulers were aware of this and tried to put a stop to encomiendas. In these laws, they established that all encomiendas that were held by the clergy or by the government could not be inherited. And so the idea was that when the current encomendero died, that meant that that land would then become free for the Native Americans who were living there. And as you might imagine, this provokes widespread opposition and a massive revolt in Peru. And although the Spanish rulers want to get rid of the encomienda system, they lack the authority to do so. They're miles away. They have to put together an army. The army has to fight against other Spaniards in the Americas. And so while they are opposed to the encomienda system in a lot of circumstances, they're not able to get rid of it. What is going to end the encomienda system in the end is going to be the decline of Native American populations. So alongside steel and horses and gunpowder, the Spanish would bring with them several silent killers that are far more deadly. And these are diseases that Europeans have natural immunity to, but which Native Americans have not been exposed to before. Smallpox, typhoid, and also measles that I put here. And these diseases run rampant among the Native American populations. And we estimate that as many as 90% of the Native American population that existed in the Americas prior to the arrival of Columbus dies as a result of these diseases. Might be a little less, but 90% is still a reasonable estimate, even though it's a higher end estimate. And so this plays an important role in shaping the way the Spanish approach the New World. And that's because these diseases are outpacing Spanish exploration and conquest. And so the microbes are moving faster than the armies and are devastating these populations. And that leads to a sense among the Spanish that before they arrived, there weren't flourishing Native American civilizations. There were just these very small populations of Native Americans that were very susceptible to diseases. And their perception of the lands that they are moving into for the first time is that these lands are empty and are ready for them to kind of impose their will upon. And so it's important to remember that this is how the Spanish viewed American lands as they were starting to settle in them. Despite the decline of the Native American population, the Spanish still require a lot of labor to cultivate the crops and the products that they're developing in the New World. Mining silver, cultivating sugar and coffee, these required intensive labor, and they're now facing a labor shortage because of the decline of the Native American populations. And so, because these unforeseen circumstances, and it's important to remember that they're unforeseen, are going to lead to the adoption of Atlantic slavery by the Spanish. This was an institution that the Portuguese have already adopted. And the reason that the Portuguese have adopted it is because the Portuguese, as we've talked about a number of times now, are interacting with the kingdoms in Africa that are practicing slavery. So you remember when we talked about Renaissance society, I explained that this is a society that's becoming more free. Even people who are serfs, so that was the closest thing to a slave that you had in medieval European society. People who were technically free but were forced to work for a particular landowner, these people are becoming free. And they're able to set their own wages, to work for a wage, to decide who they're going to work for, because of the labor shortage in Europe as a result of the Black Death. So slavery, as it's discovered and implemented by the Portuguese and the Spanish, is not a medieval institution and is not even a European institution. It's an institution that comes from the African kingdoms that the Portuguese are interacting with for the first time. And these kingdoms would make war against one another. One army would defeat another army, and some of the defeated army would be captured. And when they were captured, they were made slaves. So it wasn't as though you were born into this slavery necessarily, but it was definitely an institution that was maintained by these African kingdoms. What the Portuguese do that is different is that the Portuguese apply the new naval technology that the Europeans have access to the institution of slavery. So the Portuguese are carrying out long-distance trade with these African kingdoms, and along with the goods that the African rulers are selling to them are human goods, are human slaves. And so the Portuguese are going to engage in this trade, and they're going to bring these African slaves from the African coast to Brazil. Brazil being an area where there's much more land available to the Portuguese, and where they're setting up plantations to grow these crops like sugar and coffee. Eventually, you're going to see Portuguese slave traders taking slaves who they haven't been able to sell in Brazil along the coast of the Americas and selling them to Spanish settlers who are further north in these sorts of areas and who are suffering from a labor shortage. So this is how the Spanish and the Portuguese come to take on the institution of Atlantic slavery. As I said, it's not something that's preconceived. It's a reaction to these changes that are taking place in the world in which they're living. It's not an institution it's an institution that they bring with them to the Americas, but it was not an institution that came from their homelands. At this point, it's also important to remember that this institution isn't racially driven. How do we know this? We know this because in the 17th century, so about 50 years forward, early 1600s, the English are fighting the Irish. The English are defeating the Irish, and they are enslaving the Irish and sending them to the Caribbean to work on the sugar and coffee plantations and in the silver mines. And the Irish are treated in exactly the same inhumane way that the African slaves were treated. So this was an inhumane institution, there's no doubt about that. But at this time in the 17th century, it was an inhumane institution that was based on war and defeat in war. There wasn't a sense of someone is a slave because of their race. That's going to be a development. Racially driven slavery is going to be a development that takes place in the 18th and the 19th centuries after the end of this course. Okay, that's all I have for you for today, and we'll pick this up again on Monday.